Now.
Okay, great. All right, as I was saying, welcome back, everyone. And Mitzvos Hashem, the next installment that we're having now is we're going to explore the topic and the halachos, the ideas of Shemitah. The goal tonight will really begin to explore just the general topics and the general mitzvos. We will definitely address a few halakhic questions, but overall, I just want to give a background to the idea, as well as some of the hashkafos, the philosophy behind it. Obviously, we can't explain why God does exactly what He does in the mitzvos that He gives. We can give, meaning behind it, and at least to enrich ourselves in exactly what mitzvos we're involving ourselves with. So, just to start, just a few questions maybe to get ourselves thinking, and that is, living even inside Eretz Yisrael, if we're not farmers and we're not people who have large plots of land and we're dealing with planting things all the time, so to what degree do we really have, does Shemitah really have any relevance to us? Right, that's really the first question we have to wonder. And the truth is, all the more so, living outside Eretz Yisrael, and unfortunately, we can't live there, or those of us who are here. So all the more so, what applicability does Shemitah have to us? So it's nice. So if we'll go to visit, so we have to know the halachos, we have to know the laws. It's true. But just on a daily basis, does Shemitah play a role in our lives? And that's really one. And again, if we want to talk about the more halakhic ideas, so then, I'm not going to ask people to raise their hands here, but whoever has an apartment or any complex in Israel, so Shemitah actually becomes very applicable. A lot of apartments will have what they call a gina mishutefet, which is a shared garden, a shared area, and many of your building funds will, some go to the maintenance of that garden, maintenance of that middle area. So you have to wonder, well, if that's being maintained during Shemitah, so is that a problem? So that's another idea we'll explore. And in general, just how Shemitah works. We understand, as we'll see in the psukim, the verses, that there are certain things that are forbidden, right? We're not allowed to do kir, we're not allowed to thresh, we're not allowed to cut down and take things. We're not allowed to plow, we're not allowed to sow, sow as in plant seeds. So how does it work practically if the fact is we are bringing in produce during the Shemitah year in Israel? Farmers do bring in some of that produce. But again, the psukim, as we'll see very soon, say, lo tiksor, a person cannot reap, they can't cut. So how are we reaping and cutting? And all these questions, hopefully, we'll be able to address on some level. And again, if anyone has questions, you can feel free to either unmute yourselves briefly, and if that's harder, you can certainly put it in the chat box, and I'll try to keep a look at that and pause. So let's really just begin. That we have some of the questions on our mind, so hopefully we'll address them over the next 40 or so minutes. So let's start with verse 1. That is source 1, and we'll look at the psukim in Parshas Bahar. So the psukim say in source 1 that Hashem commanded Moshe to say the following to Bnei Yisrael. Daber al Bnei Yisrael v'amarta elehem, you should say as follows: Kisavo el haaretz, when you enter the land. So just to start, to realize that the mitzvah of Shemitah only began once we were in the land, and not just once we were in the land of Israel, but once we had actually acquired the land of Israel for ourselves. It had been divvied out to different tribes. And it's very much applicable. Shemitah is applicable to the land of Israel. The laws of Shemitah, the laws of that year, do not apply anywhere else. That is, there's no land that's commanded to rest other than the land of Eretz Yisrael. And the psukim continue. It says, Asher ani noten lachem b'shabta haaretz Shabbat Hashem. And the land should rest as a Sabbath, as a break for Hashem, in that it's designated, the land is designated towards Hashem, and we don't work. And in Pasuk Gimel, it continues, Sheish shanim tizrach hadecha. So for 6 years, you should sow your field, meaning you should plant and you should do what you're going to do. The Sheish shanim tizmor karmecha. And for 6 years, you can prune and you can tend to your vineyards. And you can gather in everything. So for 6 years at a time, you can do whatever you need to do. You can do whatever it takes to plow, to plant your field. And you see, after Shema, you'll bring in crops. And that's totally, apparently, as we know, totally permissible. But it says, Shana Hashviyas, come the 7th year, which we know as the Shemitah year, the sabbatical year. Shabbos, Shabboson, Yel Aretz. So that's going to be a Sabbath, a resting year for the land. a Shabbos Hashem, a resting year designated for Hashem. And in the bold, Sadcha le'sizra v'karmcha le'sizmor. That there are so far two things on the book, so to say, that you're not allowed to do. One is you're not allowed to plant anything, like sizra, you can't plant seeds. The karmcha le'sizmor, and you can't prune, you can't tend the trees or the vineyards in a way that you're cutting it down, intending for it to grow better. Again, now I'm no farmer, I don't know agricultural laws and the system at all, but these simple things we can understand, and that is growing. Anything that helps grow, anything that creates productivity in the field, that's what the Torah is forbidding. And it continues in the next verses, and we'll read through these just, and then we'll explain them a little bit more. And not only can you not plant, you're not allowed to reap, you're not allowed to take in the grapes, you're not allowed to take in the produce. Why? Because yet again, it's supposed to be a complete rest for the land has to rest, and not only can you not plant, not only can you not add to the productivity of the land, but you're not allowed to take the produce of the land during that year. And the second to last verse says, and that year, that resting year, so it will be for you to eat. Meaning you can eat whatever it produces, you're just not allowed to help it produce more. Everyone around you can partake in the produce of that year. And again, everyone, including the animals, will be allowed to eat. Let's take a step back for a second. So what Hashem is telling us is that we have a 6-year period where we're allowed to do whatever we want. And come the seventh year is a year where we have to rest from working the land, where the land cannot be worked. But the Torah specifies 4 specific things that are forbidden, right? It says you can't do zriya, zmira, sira, and betzira. You can't reap, and really that means, cutting down the crops. You can't do that in 2 ways, either on your vineyards or on your fields. And you can't zoreh, you can't plant, and you can't prune. So these are 4 things on the books that are biblical by nature, that are forbidden from the Torah, that a farmer, that anyone really can't do. And that's whether or not we're talking about things that produce food, right? It couldn't be, and it's not allowed that during the 7th year, a person is going to plant even flowers. Any of these that add to the productivity of the land, whether or not it's for food purposes, is forbidden. And though anything that is there, a person can eat. You can go out, and we'll learn about the next laws about everything becoming ownerless. You can go out and you can eat the fruit. You can take it and bring it to your family. It just can't be on a level of mass production, that which you're used to doing in the field. So that's just the general psukim. That's the verses that we're exposed to. In just a few points, again, there's what we can't do, but there are also mitzvos that we're supposed to do during Shemitah. There's an idea that we're supposed to let everything lie fallow, but all the fruits and everything that we own, whether a person is a farmer or whether they just have a single peach tree in their backyard or a pomegranate tree, so that becomes hefker, ownerless. And that means anyone is allowed to eat it, including, as the verses say, meaning even the animals are privy to it. The neighbors are privy to it. That guy next door is privy to it. Everyone is allowed to take from the fruits. And just to gain a little bit more clarity as to what the psukim are telling us in source 2 on Parshas Mishpatim, so it says again, for 6 years you do your work. And in verse 11 it says, then the 7th year you have to let it rest, and you have to let the land lie fallow, and all the poor people and anyone who needs to eat it can come in. So again, to outline it, we're forbidden from the Torah in 4 actions, and that is planting seeds, pruning, and reaping both your vineyard and your field. Now, it doesn't really list anything else. Meaning, if we were to stop here, so we'd walk away saying, all right, so I own a shared garden in Israel, or I'm going to go there and I'm going to wash my hands over the grass, or I own a house in Israel, so I can mow my lawn. If we stopped here, we would just have 4 things on the books that are forbidden, but really everything else should be okay. So we're going to see that it's not as simple as that. There are additional prohibitions and additional factors that we have to weigh in. But just on a d'oraisa basic level, the Torah and Hashem wanted it to be that we're not making the land work. And we're going to go into a little bit more details as far as, is it about us or is it about the land? But we'll get to that soon, but in source 3, the Rambam kind of lays it out. And he says it's a mitzvah to say, it's a positive commandment. It's not just a negative commandment that we can't work, but it says it's a positive commandment that we should rest from performing any agricultural work. During the 7th year of Shata Aretz Shabbos Hashem, it needs to be a year where the land is resting. I'm not doing any agricultural work. And he cites our psukim. And again, you can't sow your field, you can't trim it, you can't do any of these 4 things. So as far as we're concerned, there are 4 things that are forbidden, and namely because those are the main agricultural methods, right? You can't get anything without putting things in the ground, seeds, and you obviously can't accomplish selling fruits in the market or anything without reaping it. Yeah, there are important details in between, agricultural aspects, but those were the 4 things that the Torah thought were the most effective and the most effective is not the right word, the most involved, and that which causes things to produce the most. So that's on the d'oraisa level. Now, on the d'rabbanan level, meaning the rabbis came along and said, from here we see that Hashem had intention that the land should rest. So yes, it should rest from these large-scale activities, but there are many more things that cause the land to work. So what are those? Well, as we said before, watering the land, plowing is a discussion if it's biblical or rabbinic, but watering the land, fumigating, putting out pesticides, things like this. Technically, the Torah didn't list it as being forbidden, but there are additional things. What about just cutting your lawn? The weed whacker with the mower. What about those? So all of those and many others are forbidden on a rabbinic level during Shemitah. Because again, the whole idea is we have to let the land rest. Anything that's going to add to the productivity of the land and help it grow better is included in this broader umbrella of that which wouldn't be okay during Shemitah. But there's a little bit of a difference between the overarching, let's say, d'oraisa ones that the Torah said are forbidden and the rabbinic prohibitions. And that is in source 4, the Rambam outlines this, and he says in the bold, to start again in source 4, the Rambam says, see, why did the rabbis sometimes allow certain actions? For example, one could technically, and we'll see if we get into some of the details, but one could technically mow their lawn every so often during the year. Or if there's a tree that's dying during Shemitah, a person could technically do certain things to help the tree survive. So I don't understand. Does the Torah want me to help the land produce, or does it want me to let everything lie fallow? Which one is it? So the Rambam says like this, very importantly, Shim la yishke tasa aretz mlach v'yamu kol eitz sheba. That what's going to happen is if we completely leave it and we don't even water the field, we don't even water the trees, then everything's going to die. Now, God didn't say everything should die. He just said, don't work it. So Chazal, the rabbis, were sensitive to this and said, well, we're not supposed to work the land and we're not supposed to make the land produce. Well, no one ever said we should let it die. So there are a lot of halachos, a lot of laws that are actually allowed during Shemitah, which one might have thought are not allowed. So for example, one could technically water their lawn every so often during Shemitah if it meant that it would die otherwise. So that is a permissibility that's used by certain farmers, that you're allowed to water every so often, because otherwise it just won't be a field that's going to survive for the next years. If there's a tree that needs grafting because it's totally breaking and that tree won't survive, so there are some authorities which would say it can be held together in a way that's not going to perfectly solve it, because if you perfectly solve it, it'll actually really enable growth, but it can be supported, or it can be tied in a way that's not perfect, but it'll keep the tree from dying. So in general, these are ideas which we don't, as a person who owns, let's say, a small little garden, or let's say a small tomato plant in Israel, no, I don't think Chazal was saying we're going to allow you to water your tomato plant, that way it doesn't die. But on a larger scale, God didn't intend that everything should die during the Shemitah year. He intended that we shouldn't be working it and that it shouldn't be that we're trying to get it to produce more. That in order to not let it die, we're allowed to engage in the rabbinic prohibition in the cases that otherwise it would damage the land. That's just a general background to, let's say, the rabbinic laws versus the d'oraisa. On the biblical level, that's absolutely, there's no permission. On the rabbinic, there's sometimes permission to be able to save the land and help the land not die or trees not die. Again, the rabbis and Chazal were very sensitive to this. So that's really step one. That's the general background, the general idea, that which is forbidden, that which might be okay. And now, really, we get into the famous criteria. This is the question everyone has. And you'll kind of look at me maybe thinking, all right, really, that's the question. But you'll see this question, when we flesh it out, actually has big ramifications, practical ramifications in halacha. So I'll pose it to you like this. Is Shemitah, is it a rule in us, in a Jew, in a person, that we're not allowed to work the land? Or is it a rule that the land has to not be worked? Now you're saying, what's the difference? Well, is the focus, in other words, on the land, or is the focus on the person? Okay? So now, again, we'll see a difference, but let's just talk about the two sides. Now, the Minchas Chena, he's a commentary on the Sefer Chena. Mostly, he really brought to light all these concepts that a person basically can sit there and think of impossible, silly cases, even though they would never happen, but just in order to flesh out ideas, even if the case itself doesn't stand. So he lived during the 1800s, and he proposed as follows. What's the mitzvah of Shemitah? What is the command? What's the nature of it? See, he says in source 5, the mitzvah is the vatal me'avoda, to stop doing work. He says, Ubeshmita im osa avodas haaretz. During Shemitah, if a person were to work the land, could go on, for example, shechoresh sadehu, or zorea, or kotzer, he were to do any of these agricultural activities, al yedei akum, through a non-Jew. So nihi, granted, granted, you yourself are not doing that which is forbidden. You wouldn't be working the land because you were asking a non-Jew to do it. So it says that, your field, you shouldn't sow or you shouldn't plow. So granted, you wouldn't be doing something. However, the asay over the avodas karka. Nonetheless, the truth is that any time work is being done on your land, even if other people are doing it, he says in the bold, it would be a problem. Why? Because he says, we learn from the Torah is commanding us, the land has to rest. And it doesn't really matter who's doing it. If it's your field, if it's your land, I don't care who you hired to do it. I don't care if some Joe Schmo just starts working your land even without your permission. Your land has to rest. It's not dependent on the person himself. It's not dependent on who owns it per se. It's that, or who owns it, but meaning it's not dependent on who's doing it. It's the mitzvah, as God said, that Shabbos hi la'aretz, that the land itself cannot be worked. And so what that means is, according to that, I definitely couldn't hire a non-Jew to work my land. And what's more is I'd have to be worried, as the Gemara talks about, I'd have to be worried giving my land to someone who I'm worried might work it, right? If I want to rent my land to someone and I want to let him borrow my land, let's say the guy comes over. So my next door neighbor comes over and he says, so listen, I'm throwing a party next week. Can I borrow your whole field? Now, the problem is, this guy doesn't really care about halacha so much. And really what you're worried is he's actually going to take his cow outside and start plowing, because he's thinking, okay, I'll borrow this field for, a few months, pretend I'm making parties, but really I'm plowing it. Okay, someone can figure out a better case. That's what came to the top of my head. But the point being is that would be a problem, because it's my land being worked and the land cannot be worked. So in a sense, it's actually very similar to what the Gemara says, like an animal on Shabbos. See, my animal, whether or not I'm working my animal, can't be worked on Shabbos. It's seemingly a rule and a law in the actual field or the animal itself. We're not allowed to work animals on Shabbos. Okay, that doesn't really come up so much for us, but did remind me that there was two guys going on a walk with their dogs. They're not work dogs, just regular dogs. Someone had a German Shepherd, someone had a Chihuahua, and they're walking past the department store and they see there's a good sale. So the guy with the German Shepherd said, "Okay, let's go inside. It seems like a good deal." The guy with Chihuahua says, "Are you kidding me? They're not going to let us inside with dogs." So he turned to his friend and says, "Look, we're wearing sunglasses. Pull it down and follow my lead." So the guy with the German Shepherd walks into the department store, no problem, walks right in with his sunglasses down, guards ignore him. As the guy with the Chihuahua comes in, they stop him and they say, "Excuse me, sir, what are you doing?" He says, "What do you mean, what am I doing? I'm going into the store." Say, with your dog. "You can't go in with your dog." He said, "But that's my seeing eye dog." "Sir, that's a Chihuahua?" He said, "What? They sold me a Chihuahua?" Okay. So again, dogs don't work, maybe not. But I think there's just a general idea that on Shabbos, your animals can't work. And so too, the comparison, is definitely there that your land can't be worked. It doesn't depend on you, it depends on you. So that's one side of the equation. That's one way to view the mitzvah. Now the Chazon Ish, Rav Korelik, he basically takes the opposite approach. And he's not the first one to take this. He is later, much later, in 1900s, but we're talking about Tosfos Rid and earlier commentaries on the Gemara with this approach. So he kind of fleshes it out. And in source 6, he says as follows, on line 1 in source 6. Uva Tosfos Avodah Zarah, Shan. Tosfos, one of the commentaries in Avodah Zarah comments, says, Mashma, Shein ha'isr shel shvita sadeh. He says it's implied that the forbidden nature of working the field is not tali b'bayla, ela ha'ove b'sada. Rather, it's not dependent on who owns the field or the field itself. It depends on who's working the field. The forbidden nature of Shemitah, the prohibition is to work it yourself. And whoever's working it is transgressing. And he says, whoever's working, ha'ove b'sada, overall is the Shemitah. Whoever's working the field is one who's transgressing the prohibition. Ella, kavanas ha'gemara sham she'isur shel shvitas b'karka teluya ba'aveira nasa b'karka. When the Gemara says that that it's forbidden to work the land and that the land be worked, what it means to say is that it's really on the person, which means im ove ba'akum, if a non-Jew were to work the land through renting, b'schiras, who's renting your land, ein Yisrael over mishum shvita. So the Jew would not be doing anything wrong. Technically, if a non-Jew were to work my field during Shemitah, according to the Chazon Ish, there wouldn't technically be a problem. Because again, God commanded us to not work, to not do work in our field. It's not a focus on the land itself. Land is land. But a person, Hashem commanded the Torah to the person, to the people, to the Jews. And so we're the ones who the transgression is upon, and we're the ones who have the mitzvah and the command to not work the land. So by the way, here's a very good proof. It says like this. If the mitzvah, if the command, if the prohibition were to be on the field itself, and God was essentially saying, your field can't work. So very simple. My field can't work. Okay. Well, what about all those trees that are planted years ago and they're gaining nutrients from the ground? The ground seems to be working, keeping those trees going and alive, right? So the Chazon Ish says, if the other side was correct, that it was a rule on the land itself and not the person, maybe before Shemitah, there would be an obligation to rip every single tree and plant up from the ground, right? If the rule is that the land can't work, take everything out, rip it all up, start anew after the 7th year. So the Chazon Ish says, obviously, that's not a command. Obviously, that's nonsensical. It's crazy. So he says it seems to be a rule in the person, that the person can't work the land. So why does it matter for us? So very simple, a few things really. Well, first of all, can a non-Jew do work in my field? Right? Can I rent out my field during Shemitah and say, all right, well, I can't gain anything, but I'll gain some money. I'll rent it out. According to the Minchas Chinuch, who said it's a rule that the land can't be worked, obviously that would be okay. But if you held like the Chazon Ish, the simple understanding of the Chazon Ish, maybe I'm not the one working. The non-Jew is the one working, no problem. It also comes to light if I have a gina mishutefet, if I have a shared garden in the building. Now, many a times, if we own an apartment in Israel, So it's not going to be a purely religious apartment, which means, unfortunately, let's say the building complex and the building ownership has what they do during Shemitah. And they want to keep their garden nice, so they're going to keep their garden nice. They're going to plant, they're going to prune, they're going to do all these things that are obviously forbidden during Shemitah. So I don't know how everyone's building funds work, but very often with a building fund, you give the money and it's divvied up to where it needs to go. So that means some of the money that you're giving to the apartment complex is going towards this garden. So that means you're funding work in the garden. If we hold the mitzvah is that the land can't be worked and I have something to do with this land, so that's not okay. If it's a rule in the person himself, so I'm not actually working the land, so maybe it'd be okay. So for that reason, Rabbi Rimon, one of the rabbis in Eretz Yisrael, is a very fantastic book on this. So he suggests, and it's really corroborated by many modern day poskim, that if a person owns an apartment in Israel, it's not run by a religious group, and he worries that what's happening is the building is going to be tending to the garden during Shemitah in non-halakhically permissible ways, that he should do two steps. One is that you should specify money that you're giving to the fund should not be directed towards the garden. And what's more is you can still give the same sum and as whatever for your requirements, but you should specify whatever sum I'm giving is not going to the garden. Okay, take extra out for cleaning the stairs or something like that. And then on top of that, a person should say, whatever ownership or any ties I have to that garden, it's ownerless. I give it up. I have no ties to the garden. And then it accomplishes two things. It accomplishes that I'm not giving money and thereby connected to the working of the land, and nor is that land even partially owned by me. Even when it's worked, it won't be attached back to me. So for anyone who owns an apartment in Israel, that's just something to keep in mind. If you have that shared garden. There are other examples that can come to mind. I'm just trying to think. That is the main one, unless the person owns land there. But owning land. Everyone's seen this, right? The ads all over the news. Buy a plot of 4x4 in Israel. People have seen that, right? It's the thing. Okay, so I have to be careful. If anyone bought into that, great. You're supporting holy Jewish farmers, and that's a very important thing. In fact, it's very important. People should definitely give tzedakah to farmers. Just have to make sure that whoever it's going to is being directed towards farmers and not towards any other fund. But should I work hard to try to buy a 2x2 foot plot of land in Israel, right? This year, keep Shemitah. I don't farm, I don't own land, but I'll own, 4 feet of land. Is that a thing? So Rav Asher Weiss and a lot of other people basically say it depends on this here. See, if the mitzvah is that I don't work land, well, I'm not working land anyway, so who cares? But if the mitzvah is that the land shouldn't be worked, and specifically now I own land that's not being worked, so maybe I'm fulfilling a mitzvah. In general, that's the way to spell it out. In general, I don't know how much someone gains by that. What they do gain, though, is if it's going towards farmers in Israel. That's a fantastic, beautiful thing. So certainly be involved with that. Just to highlight, by the way, this whole question of is it on the person or is it on the land? So if you look in the Rambam, we won't look inside for sake of time. It's always the case, sake of time. I'm sorry. But I just have to cut down on my sources. But we'll say it outside. The Rambam actually has a very interesting formulation. The Rambam, when he starts off with his introduction to all the laws, he says that the mitzvah is that the land should rest. Okay, that's nice. The land should rest. But then almost every single time he talks about the laws thereafter, he starts saying, and you shouldn't do this, and you shouldn't do that. And it's always you. It's always on the person. So what did the Rambam mean? Is it focused on the land or is it focused on the person? I heard from Rabbi Yaakov Newberger, a Rav in Teaneck in Bergenfield, in Bergenfield, New Jersey. So he suggested that really it's a mix of both. See, in general, obviously Hashem's commanding that the land should rest. But who should it rest from? And the Rambam is saying the overall mitzvah is that the land should rest, but it should rest from you, from Jewish involvement, from Jews working the land. And that's why the Rambam gives the Hakdama, the introduction, the land should be rested. And then following that, he goes into the details of what does it mean it should be rested? Well, it should be rested from any Jewish work. And then that's why he goes in saying, and the Jew shouldn't do this, the Jew shouldn't do that. That's just a nice idea to maybe bridge the gap between these two opinions. They're not as far off as we might have thought. Really, it's one idea. So that's just in general the ideas of the land resting, not doing work, and the differences and perhaps the halacha if you own any land in Israel. Now let's skip to page 3 and source 10. Now we noted that you're not allowed to work the land. And we noted that there are additional rabbinic measures that you can't work the land even in the ways that the Torah didn't say. There's another mitzvah that happens during Shemitah, and this is kind of a nice aspect of Shemitah. They're all beautiful and nice. This is fantastic because if you're in Israel during this time period, it's great. There's tons of free fruit everywhere you go. Tons of free fruit. Why? Because the law of hekter, which means all the fruit, everything in Israel, becomes ownerless. So the Sefer Achinuch in source 10, we'll wait on that for 1 second, I'm sorry. When it says it becomes ownerless, that means technically I can walk up and take anything. It's not owned by anyone anymore. God says during the 7th year, the land lies fallow, and everything that everyone owned before, anyone can take. Now, the idea that anyone can take it, is that meaning when everything becomes hefker, when everything becomes ownerless, is that a mitzvah that I have to do? Or is God saying everything inherently is ownerless? And the reason why I'm asking is because what if you have a guy who says, are you kidding me? My fruit tree? No way. And he locks his door, he puts a big sign, says, absolutely not, don't come in here, don't touch it. So what do you think? Can I just open up his door and walk right into his orchard and take his fruits during Shemitah? God said they're hefker, God said they're ownerless, but this guy comes along and says, absolutely not. They are not ownerless. I promise you that. There's a dog, I have a gun, they are not ownerless, right? Can I go in? Is that okay? So the Mitzvos of Shemitta in source 11, he goes through both sides. And he says, there really is a machlokas, an argument, but he wants to propose that even if a person were to say, I'm not giving up ownership, God says, okay, well, I did. And it doesn't matter what a person does. The language he used is akasa de malka, meaning the king said everything's ownerless and that's it. So it comes to light that essentially if someone says, I'm not making my fruits or food ownerless, so it doesn't matter what he said. God said it is, and that's what it is. Now, he might be transgressing, meaning there's a mitzvah in addition to God making it ownerless, we have to be master, we have to make it ownerless. So he's transgressing, but it perhaps wouldn't be a problem for me to go into his field and take it. Okay, take it at your own risk with the dog and the gun. But the point being is technically it would be okay. So this is a very practical halacha now. So if anyone from Mitzvos of Shemitta will be able to visit Israel this year, regulations, we'll see. But if we go to Eretz Yisrael this year and we see a fruit tree and there's no sign, can I just walk into the guy's yard and take fruit? Yeah? I mean, everything's ownerless. We'll assume there's no sign saying otherwise. So assume he's a God-fearing Jew keeping Shemitah. So is that okay? So a lot of rabbis basically say, yeah, it's true the fruits were made ownerless, but land wasn't made ownerless, meaning his little plot of land, it's not like you can just waltz in and go there. So the truth is you can, because God said, in as much as you're able to access and eat these fruits, you can, the ground around the fruit services the fruits, and therefore how else are you supposed to eat them? But in general, just because of a common courtesy, and I mean not just common courtesy between us, but meaning halacha dictates common courtesy is much better that a person asks permission. Sometimes it's obvious people leave their gates open and it's obvious that they're just letting passerbys go in. But sometimes you will see in Israel signs that have a number on them of the person to call, and they're not going against halacha. They're not going against the law, saying please call before you enter, because essentially they're saying, listen, it's my property. God didn't say you can just walk wherever you want. But obviously, if you call me and you ask permission, obviously you can take the fruits because those are ownerless. That's just something to be aware of when Hashem, we visit Israel, that yes, things are hefker, but just to be careful that, observe common decency and common sense, common laws as far as not waltzing into everyone's private property in areas.
Rabbi,
So,
what if the fruit tree is owned by a non-Jew?
the fruit tree, so that's a good question. I assume what you're hinting at is the fact that was that made hefker, meaning did God say the fruit trees by the non-Jews were also made into ownerless, right? And that's what you're asking essentially. That's a very good question. That's also subject to a debate. What else? That's subject to a similar debate right here. If it's dependent on the person, so obviously the non-Jews weren't commanded to make their fruits, ownerless. If God just makes everything ownerless, maybe it is. I think the general assumption that we hold by is they are not ownerless, and we can't just walk in and take the non-Jews fruit. I think that's the general way we pass, and that's certainly how the Beis Yosef or Yosef Cairo held. So yeah, it's probably good to know if it's a non-Jews house also before you walk in. Okay, so that is the general halacha. I'm thinking just any other questions before we get into the last section here. Any other questions we talked about in the beginning but didn't talk?
So,
Okay.
Rabbi, you're saying that the fruit is just like lechet shikhan peah?
Yes. In general, the fruits owned by the Jews in Israel and everything is treated like lechet shikhan peah, as the pasuk says. Evyonei amecha. It's towards all the poor people or anyone. That is, anyone can take. Yes.
But then it would be very similar to chametz on Pesach because it said sadcha and not sadesh alachirim.
Right. Yes. That's interesting, actually.
Because in Pesach, you could say is lo yeh lacha chametz, but shalachirim is okay.
But sorry, say that one more time.
I'm using the word lacha. The Chumash, the Hakadosh Baruch Hu says sadcha karmacha, and he uses it. So in certain cases, he uses Shabbat for sadeh, which is just a noun, and the other times he uses it for possessive. So I would say it's very similar to chametz on Pesach. When it says lo yera lecha, you shouldn't have at your own chametz, but you could have a chametz of achirim that you can see. So here would be the same thing. So it's the Jews' field, not the non-Jews' field. It would be sadcha v'lo shel achirim.
Good. I like that, Dave. That's a very good point. Well taken. That is probably where the Beis Yosef is coming from. Rabbi Yosef Cairo felt very strongly, for example, that if a person were to take fruits or buy fruits from a non-Jew during Shemitah, they would still be subject to the rules of tithes, of maestros. During Shemitah, nothing is subject to tithes because anything which is ownerless is not subject to maestros. But, said the Beis Yosef, like what you're saying, that if non-Jews isn't ownerless, so that is subject to the laws of Meiser and tithes and the like. So yes, very in line with Beis Yosef, and point well taken. Very nice. Thank you. Okay. So before we just go on to the last section, just the general hashkafa, the philosophy of Shemitah. Any other questions on what we've done so far? I know it's like rapid pace. I'm just throwing a lot out, trying to give a background here. So if there's anything anyone wants clarity on, any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, after share is also good. Okay. So let's move on to the goal. So what does it mean, the goal? Meaning, what was the purpose? And again, I use purpose very lightly when we ask why there are certain mitzvos, because we're not privy, obviously, to God's reasoning. There are very few mitzvos in the Torah. There are a few, but they're singular, where God gives us a little glimpse into why he gave us these mitzvos. In these cases, it's more to understand just what we're supposed to gain from it and what our perspective is supposed to be from it, as opposed to wonder, why did God do this? But again, from Chazal, the rabbis, or Kodesh, to some degree, we can look at it and then understand how to apply it. So in source 12, the Rambam and the Mor Nevuchim says as follows. And he begins because he's trying to outline the mitzvos. And he tries to group them together, say there are certain mitzvos which kind of go together, and they have a very similar purpose. So he says, Re'isi l'chalik in source file, ha-mitzvos kulam. I wanted to distinguish between all the different mitzvos, the commandments, with these zos hakavana el yadal kulam. I wanted to separate them into 14 different categories. And he says as follows. One of the categories is kol ha-mitzvos asher sfarnum b'hilchos Shmita v'Yobel. All the commandments that are enumerated in the laws of Shmita and Yobel, mehem lechemla al b'nei adam. They are to have sympathy and kindness for our fellow man, and essentially have a certain level of compassion and care for every single person. Kamosha Amar, as the verse says, that all the poor people and every one of the nations should be able to eat. And a further reason he adds, on top of the main reason that it should create sympathy, kindness, love, care between everyone. An addition on top of that is that it'll be good for the land, meaning by resting the land, by letting it, go through a cycle of lying fallow and not being worked, it's going to do better later. So really, I understand this mitzvah to create kindness between everybody, because every 7 years, God says, okay, everyone take a step back from that which you own, realize it's not you, and look around. Who needs help? So he'll eat this, you'll eat that, and everyone will have a certain care for each other. But it's almost it almost doesn't belong here what he ends off saying, and that is, and by the way, it's also good for the land. On the agricultural level, it makes sense that the land should rest, right? What do they call those? There are certain cycles that they try not to work fields every year for however long because it depletes the nutrients. The Rambam is essentially adding that. By the way, on top of it's nice for other Jews, well, Hashem wants the land to do well. It's kind of a non sequitur. So Rav Lichtenstein suggested as follows, very beautiful idea, that part of the process of this chemla of kindness towards other people is allowing the land to rest in order that it will do well in the future. Because if it does well in the future, that's better for society, it's better for other people. Now, if I take this year to rest from my work and realize everything's ownerless and really everyone should partake, then hopefully that transfers into the rest of the years when my field starts doing well again, because I gave it some time to rest, as God said, and when it will overproduce or it will do better because of that in the following years, I'll have changed my mindset to think, well, this isn't just mine. I should really be helping other people with it. And it becomes a much more outward focus. So it's not such a non sequitur when the Rambam says, well, the focus is, that we should have sympathy and kindness for everyone and that the land should do well. But the land should do well for the sake of all of Yisrael, and that's the perspective a person has to have on their field. That's one approach, and certainly it's true. But the Sefer Achina, when he tries to explain a little bit behind the mitzvah, says as follows, and I think with this, we'll be able to tie back into all the previous halachos, all the laws we learned. See, the philosophy behind it really will touch upon everything we've just talked about. And he says in source 13, Mishar Shem Mitzvah, the roots of the commandment are as follows. Likboa b'libenu, to establish in our hearts, u'atzir tzior chazak, and to create a picture and a depiction b'machshavotenu in our minds, inyan chidash ha'olam, that there's a concept, that there's a creator essentially. It's in order for us to be able to paint a picture in our mind, realize that we're not the end all and be all, that there's someone much larger above us, very similar, not in the bold following, he says very similar to Shabbos, right? 6 days we work, 7th day we rest. What's the idea of Shabbos? To be able to realize, take a step back, to be able to look at my week and say, wow, Hashem, it's you, it's not me. There's a creator to the world, there's a person, there's a being who continues the existence of the world, and who am I? And he continues, and we'll skip to the bold on the last page, on page 4. And therefore, therefore God commanded that we should make ownerless everything that the land produces, the Shana is doing this year. Not only do we have to let it rest, realizing that our work is not the end all and be all, to realize that there's someone far, far above us, a being above us, but we have to make everything ownerless. In order that a person realize and to become cognizant that the land that's producing all the fruits, the Hoshana V'Shana, every single year, lo b'kocha u'skolasa totiosan. It's not through his own work. It's not through just it happening, but there's a master. There's someone who orchestrates everything. And through that, a person is able to take a step back every 7 years and realize Hashem runs our lives. Hashem runs the world. And there's nothing else. And he says, the Od Yesh Tos, there's a further purpose. Nimsa b'davar litnos b'zeh midas havatranas. A person will be able to become more giving. He'll realize it's not mine, it's not me, it's Hashem. And with that, a person will be able to establish in their mind a certain faith and trust in Hashem. To spell this out, the mitzvahs that we just talked about, as we enumerated, are that we can't work the land, whether it's that the land can't be worked or we can't work it. So one of the reasons behind that is that we take a step back and realize for all the work we can do in this world, it doesn't matter. It all comes down to Hashem. And for all the work that the land can produce, it's not the land, it's Hashem. And then the next mitzvah is we have to make all our fruits ownerless, and Hashem makes it ownerless. And why? Again, to realize everything that I own in this world isn't mine. It's Hashem. And to be able to take that after the 7th year, and when I go into the next year, to be able to take such a concept with me, to be able to realize, just to end off, I remember at this past Siyam HaShas, remember when everyone got together in groups of thousands of people? Remember those days? So at the last Siyam HaShas, I remember Rav Aaron Feldman, the Rosh Hashiva of Ner Yisrael, said as follows: why does the first Mishnah in Brachos and all of Shas, all of Gemara start with, from when do we read the Kriya Shema? When do we read Shema? That's the first Mishnah. That's the first question. Now, Brachos is all about food. And the Seder, the order of Mishnayot that Brachos starts is all about agricultural laws and about time. So why does it make sense to start those sections of the Talmud, of the Gemara, off with Shema? And what does it have to do with anything, right? If I was going to start off Brachos or the ideas of agricultural laws, I would have started off with, what Brachos do you make? Or what are the rules of tithing? Or, hey, maybe even Shemitah. Why Shema, said Rav Feldman? Said something beautiful. See, the laws of Brachos teach us that really food is not ours. It's Hashem's. We say a bracha thanking Hashem for it. And the laws of Zeraim, the laws of tithes and everything teach us that all the land in the world is not ours. And Brachos teach us all the pleasures are not ours. And you know what Shema teaches us? Is that our life is not even ours. Because the Shema teaches us that there are certain extreme circumstances where a person must, we have to give up our lives for Hashem. And we have to give up our possessions. We have to give up everything for Hashem. So he says, what other mission is start all shots, everything with, but then the lesson that nothing is truly ours. It's all Hashem. And so I think maybe that's the idea of Shemitah. Obviously, there are many other ideas floating around and underlying this. But really an encompassing idea and concept and hashkafa that ties into all the mitzvahs is, it's all Hashem. So if we have that idea, so the year of Shemitah, right? We're not farmers, it's true. Some of us don't even have apartments. And if we do, it doesn't even have that shared garden. And we might not, Mitzvah Hashem we can, but we might not even visit Eretz Yisrael this year. So we won't have to worry about which fruits can I eat. And Mitzvah Hashem next week, the next 2 weeks, we'll get into those details about how do I purchase fruits, So I might not be able to keep any laws of Shemitah. But you know what I can keep? The idea of Shemitah. The concept that Shemitah allows us to be able to look at the world and realize it's not mine, it's all Hashem. And that's the concept that we can definitely take. And through that, on some level, we're zocha to keep Shemitah. So you don't have to buy a 2x2 plot of land there to show up to keep Shemitah on that level. That's the idea. So I think that was just, again, a general introduction to the laws of Shemitah, just the general laws. And in Mitzvah Hashem, in the coming weeks, we'll talk about more particulars as far as how to buy fruits, what fruits one can buy, how do you treat the fruits. And yeah, in Mitzvah Hashem, we'll learn a lot more about Shemitah as we go along. So thank you everyone again for coming out on, now it's earlier, Sunday night. But thank you for coming. I'll stay on for a little bit longer if anyone has any questions, want to ask any good kashas. Just so everyone knows, usually the really good kashas come once after the shir. So, okay. Anyway, thank you. What's up? Okay.